All right, so we just left behind the economic aspect of the Jacksonian period. And of course, you know that's the market revolution by now. And we discussed how this is marked by the market pervading all aspects of life. It becomes an inescapable feature of everyday life for average Americans. And it gives rise to the working class as we define it in this course, and the rise of factories and transportation systems, right, connecting the country, and of course the goal here is economic nationalism with the market revolution, right? Okay, so alongside that revolution, which is economic, well, we also have a political revolution, and that's referred to as Jacksonian democracies, also known as Jacksonian freedom. Okay, and what is this? Basically, it's providing universal male suffrage. Okay, that is to say, everyone, well, male, I should say, okay, and white male, I have to further say, all white males have the right to vote, even if they don't own property, which back then property meant land, okay, land ownership. And this goes back all the way to our discussion of early English settlement. If you recall, in England itself, there was this connection between land ownership and political independency, right? If you owned land, then you were economically independent. You weren't beholden to a lord, right, or the land owner there in England. And therefore, since you weren't beholden, well, this allowed you to have some political freedoms, right, to participate in politics. And that got transferred over to, the English colonies, right, in North America, as we discussed. Okay, so that is still around in the beginning of the Republic. Okay, not all states, but many states still believe that for those who had the right to participate in democracy, to vote and to run for office or what have you, to be part of the public sphere, to use their term, well, you had to own land. There were property qualifications that had to be met before you could be engaged in politics, right? These are conditions. Now, Jacksonian freedom means you eliminate property qualifications, right? And to translate that in more simpler terms, it means that you could be poor, right? And you could still vote in this country or participate in the political process, right? And that's what we mean by universal male suffrage. And this is also referred to as mass democracy because before, it's easy to imagine that democracy was very exclusive, right? If you had to own land, right? As again, a precondition to participate in the public sphere. But now that's been eliminated, right? And here's the connection with the market revolution, right? Um, well, is land ownership as important if you see the demise of the family farm, at the same time the rise of the industrial city, right? You see more emphasis on urban areas rather than rural, right? Well, that means land ownership becomes less essential in politics because you see the rise of industrialization and commercialism, right? I mean, even today, this anyone who's listening here own land, right? And uh, is grows their own food in that land, right? And sustains themselves. I would I'd be willing to bet that no one listening, right, fulfills those conditions. Okay, so in other words, it's not a qualification today, right? Okay, but here is when you see it actually eliminated, right? This idea of the poor, um, who were traditionally left out, now are allowed entry into it. Okay, that's what it means, universal male suffrage. By the way, President Jackson, never passed a law that said, a federal law that said, oh, from now on, property ownership no longer is necessary to vote. Okay, they attach it to Jackson because he symbolized that everyday person. He wasn't from the aristocracy, so to speak, to use an expression. In American society, the well heeled, such as Jefferson, Hamilton, and Washington, right? No, he was more of an ordinary guy. Okay, even though at the end of his life he became wealthy and owned slaves, but he was more or less a person from of humble origins, and he rose up right on his own to be a famous general and then the president. In fact, he's Scots Irish, not English, interestingly enough. Okay, so because he symbolized this, the everyday person, well, that's why it gets attached to Jacksonian democracy. He represented it, right? Of course, he advocated, but again, previously there were state laws that determined whether or not a person could vote based on property, right? But now, state after state they begin to eliminate the property qualification, and it's during Jackson's tenure as president. So that's why. It's another reason, of course, why it gets attached uh, to Jackson. Okay. All right. So this is what Jacksonian freedom refers to. Now, on the slide there, it says overcoming the belief in a quote tyranny of the majority. Okay. Now, that's an interesting phrase, the tyranny of the majority. Why? Because let's go back to the American Revolution. And recall, we went over the Declaration of Independence. Who was called the tyrant by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence that he wrote, right? Well, the tyrant was King George III, right? And, he's the king. He's the one who's committing tyranny, Jefferson argued. Um, he's the one committing tyranny over the colonials, right? And therefore, they said, well, we could separate our bonds with England. Okay, so notice with tyranny of the majority, however, the idea here is that the majority of the people could be tyrants, right? Okay, so how could that be? Well, this goes back to why, before Jacksonian freedom, it was felt that the average person should not be given so much political freedom. Okay, well, it's and you could go back all the way to political philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, right? They felt that this idea of mass democracy could be dangerous, right? Why? Because they felt that the everyday person, and then the masses, as we could refer to them, right, really don't know the best way to conduct political affairs and to think about politics in the best interest of that country or empire, what have you, right? And back then, you didn't have widespread public education. A lot of people were uneducated, right? So how could we invest so much democracy in our country and allow them entry, right? How can we really commit ourselves to democracy when even the poorest and the uneducated are, in principle, allowed the same amount of political freedoms than the well-educated, right, and well-heeled of society. Okay, so again, this goes back to Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, and all the European philosophers following that. They really felt that democracy could be dangerous, and even the founders. Okay, the founders, who of course drafted our Constitution, and before that, the Declaration, they felt that democracy could be dangerous. Okay, in fact, they sought to shield the republic from excessive democracy. When you think of things like the Electoral College in our Constitution, even things like the Supreme Court, well, those were structured deliberately, right, to prevent excessive democracy. Okay, and that phrase, the tyranny of the majority, basically is a belief that democracy could be dangerous if it's given to everyone, right? If everyone is allowed some participation in democracy, why? Again, because some of them, won't be able to, um, you know, will be ill equipped, let's use that, to reason about the best uh, pursuits in politics, the best thing to do, that many of them will be easily persuaded by rhetoric, right? Empty rhetoric. They'll be thinking more emotional than rational. Okay, so all of these things were thought to be dangerous to democracy. Okay, so notice the next phrase here. Democracy no longer rested upon ownership of property, but ownership of self. So, how do we think about that? Well, despite the fear of the quote tyranny of the majority, despite the fear of excessive democracy and mass democracy in general, well, our country did uh, innovate when it comes to democracy in providing that everyday person, of course, it's still gendered male, right? But that everyday person the right to participate in democracy. Okay. In many ways, the United States led the way in providing mass democracy, right? Okay, so what does that mean? It means that, as that as that statement refers to, it no longer rested upon ownership of property, right? Democracy no longer was based on whether you owned land or not. If not land ownership, then what? What is it based upon, right? Well, one aspect of that is ownership of self. And we talked about this with possessive individualism, right? How you own yourself as an individual. It's felt that if you're free, right, not a slave, but free, then you could participate in democracy. Okay, so there's a shift there from thinking about democracy based on property ownership to that about self ownership, if you will, right? The ownership of your own person. And that's what we mean by possessive individualism.